From today, your mother will be living with us in this house. Actually, we are dating. My husband told me proudly. I've got both a boyfriend and a housekeeper. Of course, by housekeeper I mean you. She leaned on my husband's shoulder and laughed at me mockingly. How can these people say such things so calmly in this situation? I had just received a call that my childhood home had burned down and went to see it. I was shocked that my childhood home, filled with memories of my late father, was gone. However, in contrast to me, my mother seemed calm, and I felt it odd that she wasn't sad about her house burning down. But I never thought that right after bringing my mother home with my husband, they would say such ridiculous things. As I was dumbfounded by them, my husband laughed and asked, "Too shocked to even speak? You must be completely surprised to hear that your mother and I are dating." My husband laughed foolishly. "We are so in love." "Sorry, dear. Now that I'll be living here, you'll need to take good care of me as a housekeeper. For starters, I'd like steak for dinner tonight." At her words, I retorted sharply. "That's too cheeky." I don't usually use such harsh words, so they both looked stunned. "I knew about your relationship. I have proof, and I will be filing for compensation. My name is Julia. I am a 35-year-old salesperson at a trading company. I met Greg, a web designer, through work. Greg was very serious about his work and also had a flexible mind. I admired him and wanted to get to know him better, so I boldly invited him to dinner. Being with the easygoing Greg made me feel at ease, which was very comforting. Things progressed smoothly from there, and we started dating. 2 years later, Greg proposed to me. "Julia, let's get married. I will never meet a woman more wonderful than you in my life. Will you stay by my side forever?" Normally, Greg wouldn't say such cheesy lines, but he said it with a shy smile this time. His voice was a bit shaky, probably from nervousness. "Of course. I couldn't meet anyone better than you either, and I can't love anyone but you. Let's get married." I responded to his proposal with as much love-filled words as he did. Shortly after, Greg came to greet my mother at my family home. My father had passed away from an illness 5 years ago, so my mother was living alone. My 58-year-old mother looks so young, she could be mistaken for someone in her 40s or even 30s. Not only is she beautiful, but she also doesn't neglect efforts to look young. With luxurious eyelash extensions, vivid pink lipstick, beautifully curled long hair, and wearing a miniskirt, no one would think she is 58. My mother has always been beautiful, and during school events, my classmates would exclaim, "Who's that mom? She's so pretty," making me happy. However, when they realized she was my mother, they would start saying, "You don't look like her," which always made me feel down. Indeed, I did not resemble my mother, instead, I looked more like my late father. Facing my beautiful mother, a nervous Greg greeted and introduced himself. "Hello, it's nice to meet you. I'm Greg. I look forward to getting to know you." After examining Greg from head to toe, my mother suddenly beamed with a smile. "Greg, don't be so nervous. I'm Julia's mother. Let's all have some coffee together." With a higher-pitched voice than usual, she led Greg to the living room. "Yes, thank you." Relieved by my mother's welcoming demeanor, Greg seemed at ease. However, for some reason, my mother sat next to Greg. I ended up sitting across from both of them and couldn't help but express my displeasure. "Mom, why are you sitting next to Greg?" "Oh come on, it's fine. It's easier to talk honestly next to someone than across from them. After all, he's going to be my dear daughter's husband, so I need to get to know him well." She smiled sweetly. Greg looked a bit perplexed but said, "Julia, I'm okay with this." "See, Greg says it's fine." While saying that, she intertwined her arm with Greg's. "Hey. Don't link arms. Greg is troubled too." "Oh come on. A little bit is fine." "Julia, you're so noisy." Reluctantly, she unlinked her arms. Greg, Julia has always been very outspoken. She gets angry quickly. Greg smiled at me in a reprimanding manner. Later, as the three of us had coffee, my mother was in a great mood throughout. Greg is really wonderful. I'm so happy that Julia is marrying such a handsome man. She subtly kept touching Greg throughout, though she no longer linked arms with him. I didn't scold her each time, but I felt a persistent discomfort. As the greeting was nearing its end, Greg spoke up formally. May I pray to your late husband's portrait? Oh, I'm delighted. The portrait is this way. Pleased, she led Greg to the portrait. Impressed by Greg's courteous nature, my mother was very fond of him. He's really a proper man. On the way back from my parents' home, I felt the need to apologize to Greg for my mother's behavior. Greg, thank you for today. I'm sorry my mother was so clingy and touchy. No, it's totally fine. I'm relieved that your mother is such an approachable person. It looks like we'll get along well. I was worried that Greg might be annoyed by my mother's overly familiar attitude, but his words reassured me. The following week, we visited Greg's parents' home and we were able to register our marriage without any issues. After moving into our new home, we began our married life. Although our days were going smoothly, there was one thing I felt guilty about. Due to frequent business trips for my job, I often had to leave home early in our marriage. Working from home, Greg took care of the household chores while I was away, and I felt guilty about it, but he supported my work without any complaints. I'm not great at housework, but since you usually do most of it, I've got to put in some effort when she's away. Seeing Greg smile as he said that, I deeply felt how fortunate I was to have married him. One day, when I returned from a business trip, there was an unexpected person at home. Julia, welcome back. The stew will be ready soon, let's eat together. I've already made the salad and put it in the fridge. Mom, you're here? Yes, the person stirring the pot and smiling was my mother. Since it's tough for me to handle the housework alone, your mom came over to help. It's been a real lifesaver. Sitting comfortably on the living room sofa, Greg happily informed me. Look, the stew is ready. Let's all have dinner. Saying this, my mother arranged the salad, cream stew, and baguette on the table. The delicious smell made my stomach growl. Mom, thank you. Let's eat. I thanked my mother and enjoyed her homemade food. It had been a while since I had her cooking, and the familiar taste filled me with warmth. This is delicious, Mother. I could eat this forever. Greg also praised my mother's cooking, and she looked pleased. After enjoying a pleasant dinner together, my mother said, "Oh, look at the time. I should be going," and began to prepare to leave. Mom, thank you for today. Oh, don't mention it. I'll come over to cook again. As I thanked her, my mother smiled happily. From then on, whenever I went on business trips, my mother would come over to take care of the house. I was grateful to her, but Greg's behavior suddenly became strange. It happened one ordinary morning. We were having breakfast together, and while I was washing dishes, Greg suddenly spoke up. Julia, why don't you grow your hair out and try curling it? As it is now, you seem to lack femininity, maybe it's charm that's missing. What? Why all of a sudden? It was the first time Greg had said something like that, so I was shocked. Well, Julia, you just lack sex appeal. Your makeup is so natural, too. Can't you make it more glamorous? I don't like heavy makeup. And I prefer my hair short like this. I answered calmly. Then, Greg laughed mockingly. Huh, I can't believe such a plain woman is the child of such a beautiful mother. What? I couldn't believe my ears. I had never imagined that such a day would come. Why would you say such a terrible thing? Why compare me to Mom? I asked, trembling. It's just the truth. Greg said dismissively and retreated to his room. Despite my pleas for him to stop, he continued to compare me with my mother, and I felt my love for him fading. One day, I returned from a 3-day business trip, and my mother had come over to cook again. Julia, welcome back. I made fried chicken today. While I was grateful that my mother came to help, Greg's recent constant comparisons between me and her had started to upset me. Mom, you came today too. Thank you. I kept my swirling dark emotions hidden and thanked her as usual. My mother smiled warmly at me, but Greg sighed softly upon seeing my face. Oh, you're back already. I felt my heart grow cold at Greg's words, but I pretended not to hear and went to the bedroom to put away my luggage. As I looked down at the floor, I noticed a long strand of hair. Picking it up, I muttered, "Why is this here in the bedroom?" It was clear that the hair wasn't ours. Mine is short, and so is Greg's. Sensing that it belonged to my mother, I immediately returned to the living room. Hey, there was a long hair in the bedroom. This is Mom's, isn't it? Why is it in the bedroom? I asked my mother and Greg, trying to remain calm. Both looked surprised at first, but then my mother started to laugh. Oh my, you're right, it's my hair. It must have fallen out when I was cleaning the bedroom today. Exactly, your mother was kind enough to clean our bedroom. You should be grateful. Greg agreed with her. Despite being my mother, the fact that she had entered our bedroom made me uncomfortable, and I couldn't help but suspect something about their relationship. However, since my mother had been helping out with the housework, I couldn't press the issue further. Around this time, my accessories and bags started to mysteriously disappear from the bedroom. I asked Greg about it, but he kept insisting he didn't know anything. About a month later, Greg said something like this. You know, I've got a business trip coming up tomorrow. It's just for 1 night and 2 days. Although he usually works from home, occasionally he does visit clients. Really? That's unusual. I didn't think much of it at the time and just responded casually. However, Greg seemed unusually cheerful while packing for the trip, which gave me a bad feeling. Curious, I decided to check the contents of his travel bag while he was in the bath. Inside, I found travel brochures and new clothes that clearly weren't for work. This isn't for a business trip, is it? It was probably for a vacation. And if it were a solo trip, he wouldn't need to lie to me about it being a business trip, which means he must be going with a woman. That woman was likely my mother. I had always suspected something between Greg and my mother, but now I was convinced they were indeed having an affair. My head was a mess with anger and disappointment, but I quickly put everything back as I heard the bathroom door open. Although I wanted to confront Greg immediately, I decided to wait until I had solid proof. Well, I'm off. The next day, as he left with a broad smile, I watched him go, sighing inwardly. I considered following him to gather evidence of his infidelity, but then remembered something crucial and decided to check it immediately. The afternoon after Greg left for his trip, he unexpectedly called me. Hey, Julia. Something terrible has happened. I'm at your parents' house right now, and it's completely burned down. What? I couldn't help but respond incredulously. Stop joking around. I'm not joking. Come to your parents' house right now. Your mom is in a daze. It seemed they were together after all. Although I wanted to confront them about this, I was more concerned about my parents' house being completely destroyed. Explain in detail. As I asked calmly, Greg started to explain. It seems the fire was caused by a cigarette my mother discarded in a trash can. Fortunately, the houses nearby were far enough away that the fire didn't spread. I have many things I want to ask you both, but for now, I'm heading over there. I ended the call and rushed to my parents' house. It was indeed completely burned down, and the area was crowded with onlookers. Seeing my childhood home, filled with memories of my father, gone was a shock, and I almost collapsed from grief. However, I managed to hold myself together and stared at the charred remains. Then Greg and my mother approached me. In stark contrast to my sorrow, both of them were smirking. It seemed my mother had been questioned by the police but was released as there was no sign of foul play. Let's go home. With that, we took my mother back to our house. As soon as we arrived, Greg announced cheerfully. From today, your mother will be living with us in this house. I've got both a boyfriend and a housekeeper. Of course, by housekeeper I mean you, Julia. Leaning on Greg, she declared this. At this, my patience finally snapped. Don't joke about this. How can you say such things so calmly in this situation? Mom, our family home burned down. The house filled with memories of Dad is gone. Greg, you're really out of line. I shouted at them, but Greg just laughed and said, Don't get so worked up. Showing that my words didn't affect him at all. Mother similarly laughed. Oh, Julia, you're too angry. By the way, Greg and I will share a bedroom, so Julia, you sleep in another room. Dumbfounded by their attitude, I fell silent. Then Greg added. What's the matter, too shocked to speak? Julia, you must be surprised to find out that your mother and I are dating. Still laughing foolishly, he continued. We're so in love. Sorry, dear. From today, I'll be living here too, so you'll need to take care of me as a housekeeper. At her words, I couldn't help but retort sharply. Disgusting. You're too shameless. I already knew about your relationship. I have evidence, so expect a lawsuit for damages. What? Evidence? Both Greg and my mother looked stunned, but I showed them the hidden camera I had installed in the bedroom. Lately, my personal items from the bedroom have been disappearing, so I set up a camera thinking I'd catch the thief. But what I found was you two cheating. So, you knew. Well, that makes things easier. Honestly, I prefer your glamorous mother over a plain and boring woman like you. Let's get a divorce. Looking down on me, Greg said, and my mother also smiled. Sorry, Julia. You don't need to tell me, of course, we're getting divorced. I then opened my laptop, downloaded the divorce papers from the government website, and printed them out. I signed my part and handed them to Greg. Sign your part, quickly. You're surprisingly obedient. I thought you'd make more of a fuss. Why would I fuss? My love for Greg had turned into less than zero. As I said earlier, I'll be suing you both for damages. Be prepared. At my words, my mother burst into laughter. Go ahead, sue us for as much as you want. Greg also chuckled. Julia is such a greedy woman. Ignoring them, I began to pack my essentials and left the house with the filled-out divorce papers. After submitting the divorce papers at the town hall, I decided to stay at a hotel and started looking for a lawyer immediately. I was filled with strong anger, thinking about bringing both of them down as I browsed through various law firms' websites. However, I knew that even without my intervention, they would end up facing painful consequences. There was something about Greg that my mother didn't know. If she found out about that thing, she would definitely cry out in despair. The next morning, I was awakened by a call from my mother. Hey. What do you mean Greg has debts? I didn't know about this. She shrieked right as she started talking, and I couldn't help but smile. Yes, Greg actually had debts. Greg had tried to start a business before we were married and failed, but I knew about it and married him anyway. I was prepared to help him repay his debts, and I had been assisting with the repayments until now. Julia, are you listening? I thought Greg was a high earner. He gave me lots of gifts. As her voice trembled, I responded coldly. Greg, a high earner? That's not possible. Most of his salary goes to debt repayment. He used to contribute to the bare minimum living expenses, but recently he's been spending it on gifts for you, so I've been covering our living costs. Since Greg started making comparisons between me and my mother, he had almost stopped contributing to the household expenses. What? Wait, what about the compensation? I thought Greg would pay that. My mother shrieked. I will demand compensation from both Greg and you. I'm currently looking for a lawyer, so I'll send you the bill later. You said I could sue for as much as I wanted, so expect it to be a hefty amount. Make sure you pay it. Wait. I don't want a poor man. I'll return Greg to you, so please don't demand compensation. I don't have any savings. Return him? I don't want such a man. Besides, I've already submitted the divorce papers. You'll hear from my lawyer about what comes next. Goodbye. I said coldly and hung up the phone. Then, I immediately went to a real estate agent to look for a new place to live and signed a contract as soon as I found a suitable property. During this time, my mother kept calling me, so I got annoyed and set her number to auto-reject. After a while, a meeting was arranged with the lawyers involved. Greg and my mother showed up with a tense atmosphere. A few days earlier, I had received a voicemail from Greg saying that my mother had abruptly dumped him. She changed her attitude the moment she found out I had debts. She looked at me like I was trash and dumped me just like that. I thought she would help me repay the debts just like Julia did. It's too heartless. I never imagined it would come to this. That was the content of the voicemail, but of course, I didn't call him back. It seemed my mother was hopping from one acquaintance's house to another, and now Greg was living alone in the house where we used to live together. I told Greg and my mother. As I said the other day, I will be claiming damages for adultery from both of you. Greg visibly grimaced and muttered. Are you really going to claim compensation? My mother was shrieking. I don't have any money. To which, I calmly responded. Also, the hidden camera I installed in the bedroom captured you, Mom, taking my bags and jewelry boxes. At my words, my mother flinched and started gaping. So, I'll also be demanding compensation for theft. Don't be ridiculous. I'm your biological mother. It's absurd to demand money from a mother. My mother's face turned red as she shouted at me. You did just that, Mother. Among the jewelry you stole were valuable items given to me by business associates. By the way, where did you put those stolen items? Do you still have them? When I asked, my mother defiantly said. I've already sold them. At a recycle shop near the station. But that's okay. A daughter's belongings belong to her mother. Think of it as filial piety and let it slide. Please, I beg you, don't demand any money. At my mother's words, I sighed deeply. Stop talking nonsense. You're no longer my mother or anything to me. You must pay the money. As I spoke coldly, tears welled up in my mother's eyes, and she looked utterly despondent. How could this be? I spent all of Dad's inheritance, and I switched to Greg because he seemed wealthy. Everything has backfired. If I knew he had debts, I would never have gotten involved with him. It seemed my mother had only ever seen Greg as a source of financial support. What? You were after my money from the start. You said you loved me. Greg shouted at my mother. Loving you was obviously a lie. How could I truly love a man who's just somewhat handsome? You should have told me about the debts from the start. Mother and Greg yelled back and forth at each other. The lawyer intervened, and they finally stopped arguing. Hey, Julia. You know best how tough it is for me with these debts. I can't afford to pay compensation. How about we start over? I really need you. Greg pleaded for reconciliation, but I looked at him with disdain. Absolutely not. You only want to reconcile so you can wipe the compensation and have me help with the debts again, right? I can see right through you. Greg couldn't say anything back and just groaned. I told the pale-faced Greg and my mother one last thing. Both of you, you reap what you sow, enjoy your descent into hell together. Later, my mother managed to contact the recycle shop where she had sold my belongings and was able to buy back most of the items. However, she still ended up with debts she couldn't repay. It seems that both Greg and my mother ended up declaring bankruptcy. Unable to pay the rent after months of arrears, Greg was forced to vacate his apartment. As both their lives became more difficult, they reluctantly decided to cooperate and live together, moving to a cheap, dilapidated apartment. The apartment they moved into is about 50 years old and doesn't have a bath. A while later, Greg called me. I considered ignoring it, but a part of me was curious about how Greg and my mother were doing, so I answered. Hello? Julia. Please, I can't stand this life anymore. Lend me some money. Greg began to cry out desperately. Excuse me? There's no way I would lend you money. Besides, I even agreed to let you pay the compensation in installments, and you haven't even finished paying that off yet. I actually wanted the compensation paid in one lump sum, but he pleaded with me, saying he couldn't possibly pay all at once, so I allowed him to make installment payments. Likewise, my mother had begged me to let her pay in installments, so I reluctantly agreed. I can't do this anymore. I can't pay anymore. I declared bankruptcy, and they seized my computer, so I lost my job as a web designer. Now I'm barely getting by with day labor, but it's really tough since it's physical work. He continued to plead while crying, but such things were of no concern to me. As I remained silent, Greg kept talking rapidly. The apartment is so run down it's the worst. There's no bath, so I have to go to the public bath, but even the bathhouse fee is a struggle. There's no air conditioner in the room, so I'm nearly getting heat stroke, and it's so small that my mother-in-law and I are always irritable and fighting non-stop. Greg's voice became tearful, but I felt no sympathy. I don't care about your job loss, your tough day jobs, or your terrible room. Of course, I also don't care about what happens between you and your mother. All I care about is getting the compensation payments. Why are you being so cold? Weren't we married? Was our bond really just that? Anger clouded my vision as Greg spoke. Don't say such absurd things. Who was it that cheated on me with my own mother? Who destroyed our trust if not you, you awful man? Why? It was the first time I had ever yelled at him like this, and he seemed shocked. It's also my fault for not seeing your true colors and marrying you. If I could, I would go back in time and tell myself that you were the worst right from the moment we met. Isn't that a bit much? Greg responded defensively, clearly shaken. Look, I'm reflecting on it, just lend me a little money. Don't be so cold. You're the one making me say this. I will absolutely not lend you any money. Do you realize how much I've already spent on your debt repayment? Well, I chose to help you with your debt, so I won't complain about that. But stop making ridiculous requests. I firmly told him off, but Greg was still muttering but. Don't contact me ever again. If you need something, go through my lawyer. Goodbye. Wait. Okay, I won't ask for money anymore. But I have a favor to ask of you. Your mother is still splurging on designer bags. Could you at least tell her to stop that? Greg hurriedly spoke in a panicked tone. I don't care. You two got back together, right? Figure out how to help each other and survive. Goodbye. I hung up the phone and immediately set Greg's number to auto-reject. Later, I heard that my mother, unable to curb her spending habits, had contacted a loan shark she found in a flyer in the mailbox. She borrowed a large sum and spent it instantly on designer clothes and bags. Of course, she had no means to repay it and began living a life on the run from dangerous people. Through the lawyer, I heard that my mother was asking for my help, but I naturally ignored it. I hadn't expected my mother to be so obsessed with luxury and brands. When my father was alive, we lived more modestly. Perhaps inheriting my father's estate had caused her to lose control. Memories of my childhood with my mother came flooding back. In our old house that burned down, I used to bake cookies with her. She prepared various cookie cutters and even changed the dough's flavor to match my mood. In those memories, my mother smiled kindly, and I loved her very much. There was a time like that. Gradually, her makeup became heavier and her clothes flashier. There must have been a reason for my mother's change. Now, I neither know nor want to know. One thing is clear, the mother I have now is not the mother I loved. Exhausted from being chased by debt collectors, My mother and Greg moved away like fugitives in the night but somehow continued to make monthly payments, so they must be alive somewhere. As for me, I'm more focused on my work than ever. Since I no longer have to help with Greg's debt repayments, my savings are growing. I'm planning to take a long vacation and travel alone soon.